So we'll see what Congress comes up with and how far it goes. But in the meantime, the U.S. keeps enduring more mass shootings. According to the Gun Violence Archive, and if you're not looking at the TV, look up for just a second. You need to see this map. In the 2 weeks since the shooting at Robb Elementary in Uvalde, Texas, there have been more than 30 additional mass shootings. Everything you see on the map now, that's all just since Uvalde. 13 of these attacks happened in the last weekend. Those resulted in at least 17 deaths and 69 injuries. That was this weekend. One attack happened in a tourist-heavy area of South Street in Philadelphia. So while lawmakers try to come up with something, anything, that will reduce gun violence, what about the rest of us? Where might we fit into those plans? And what should we know about the problem that could help us think about solutions? Let's continue now with Dr. Jooyoung Lee. He's an associate professor of sociology at the Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Toronto. Professor Lee, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So we mentioned the shooting in Philadelphia, 3 dead, 11 injured at least, as far as we know, in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Police Department says they have a person of interest in custody. You did quite a bit of research on gun violence in Philadelphia, as I understand it. And based on that, I wonder what your reactions are to what we saw this weekend and what we're seeing across the country right now.
I mean, yeah, the bulk of my gun violence research was done in Philadelphia, and my heart breaks for Philly every time I hear stories of shootings of young people. By the way, Philadelphia is a city where 80% of the victims are young Black men, and it's a perennial ongoing problem. There's no secret, but the vast majority of the gun violence afflicts the most underserved, racially marginalized communities across Philadelphia, and it's been an ongoing problem. So I think the big thing that I think of a lot of times with Philly is that it's a city with a poverty rate where approximately 1/3 of the city is living below the poverty line. We know that the spread of gun violence is concentrated in poor Black neighborhoods, and that the primary victims are young Black men who are gravitating to the illicit economy or gangs, picking up a gun because there are so few opportunities for them to move up in the world. So it's a very complex issue that requires addressing these underlying structural conditions that funnel at-risk young men into street violence.
I wonder if for that reason, Professor Lee, we might be talking about a few different problems in the U.S. I keep feeling like we're not having an apples-to-apples conversation on what we mean by gun violence. I think the kind of gun violence that would affect someone who looks like me, right, feels very different than the kind of gun violence that would affect a community like Newtown, Connecticut, which feels different from the kind of gun violence that would affect a community like Uvalde, Texas. And I don't know that we all look at it the same way because, well, Philadelphia is Philadelphia, but then a nice, quiet suburban community being affected by gun violence. You know what I'm saying? It feels like we may not be having an apples-to-apples conversation on what we're actually trying to address.
Yeah, and that's exactly one of the big problems. One of the knee-jerk reactions to shootings that happen in places like Philadelphia is to assume that the victims were all affiliated with gangs or illicit or were participating in the illicit drug economy. But a lot of times people are just in the wrong place at the wrong time. John Rich, who's a researcher at Drexel, has done some great research on this, and so have I in my work. And we often don't give the victims of shootings in places like Philly or Chicago or Oakland or Memphis or other Black cities with long histories of Black communities, that benefit of the doubt. We assume that they were doing something to get themselves shot. And that's simply not the case. When you talk to people like I did in the hospital at University of Pennsylvania and interview people, you realize that a lot of times people are bystanders. In other cases, you have people who want to get out of that life, but because of the way that we perceive them, they don't have the same kinds of exit options. So I think the kind of heartbreak that we feel when we hear about shootings in places like Newtown, we have to extend that same sort of empathy to Black men, Latino men, and other men of color who are being shot in our streets.
I would also add to that LGBTQ people, because there were police in West Palm Beach, in my hometown, that thwarted an attempt by a young man who claimed that he was going to shoot up the Pride celebration this past weekend. So sometimes you can just get shot just by being a person that nobody really cares about. That is another factor we got to deal with at some point. With regard to what Congress is considering, I wonder what you think of some of the ideas that are apparently on the table. We heard from our Sahil Kapoor tonight that a number of things are being considered, including some measures related to mental health, possibly red flag laws. Assault weapon restrictions do not appear to be on the table. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that the Democrats have had a hard time historically moving legislation at the federal level with regards to bans on semi-automatic rifles. And, I think the move to introduce red flag laws, to expand background checks, those are all very positive. There's a lot of good research out there that shows the efficacy of red flag legislation. Now, the tricky thing with red flag laws is that ideally they're supposed to work when somebody reports that they know a person who is at risk of harming themselves or other people. But sometimes that can take a little bit of time, and it can require administrative work that isn't so timely. And so that's one of the questions that people like me always have about red flag laws and how it'll actually work when it's put into action. And I think the background check thing is a no-brainer. The U.S. still has a system where there is not universal background checks, which is ludicrous. Right now, people who want to commit a mass shooting overwhelmingly buy their guns legally. They don't get them from some kind of underground network of traffickers. They go to the store and they sail through the background check system because it's so easy to get a firearm. So I think those are two very common sense laws that make a lot of sense. And I'm hopeful that something will happen. But as we've seen time and time again, oftentimes there's a lot of partisanship and back and forth, and who knows what will happen.
Sociologist Jooyoung Lee of the University of Toronto. This has been real helpful, and I appreciate you coming on to share your thoughts with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.